Hello, everyone. I'm Marcia Cavanaugh. Thanks for joining us. Well, in the beginning of this new year, we are looking at two parallel campaigns, one hoping to extend to February 2nd, the other hoping to be resolved by then. For the Saints, that would mean a return to the Super Bowl. For local candidates, the hope is for a victory without a runoff in the February 1st primary. We'll look tonight at the financial records of mayoral candidates and at the Saints hoping to reverse their road game record. We'll also examine some of the highs and lows in higher education during this past year. Businesses to watch in the new year, a coroner retiring after 40 years, and this might be the year of resolution for a troubled downtown building. Starting the year for us are tonight's Informed Sources. Errol, Laborde, producer of Informed Sources. John Pope, reporter, NOLA.com, the Times-Picayune. Kathy Finn, freelance business journalist. And Tyler Bridges, reporter, The Lens. And we're going to turn first to Tyler and taking a look at some past tax issues that some of the mayoral candidates experience. You recently did an article about that. Tell us more about that.
Yeah, I got a packet in the mail sent to me anonymously showing that former Judge Michael Bagneris had some tax problems from 1984 to 1990. These are public records filed at the Orleans Parish Courthouse. And rather than just write the story based on his tax problems, my colleague Charles Maldonado went down to the courthouse, and we actually did our own check on those records to confirm they were accurate. And we confirmed that Michael Bagneris, who's now seems to be the main challenger to Mitch Landrieu, from 1984 to 1990. He had run up $100,000 in state and federal tax liens, and we also found that Donatus King, who's also running for mayor, the head of the local NAACP, that he had run up $50,000 in back taxes from 1998 to 2004. We also checked Mayor Landrieu. We didn't find anything on him, but we found that his wife Cheryl had owed about $2,500 in some state tax liens. So when I interviewed Michael Bagneris about this, doesn't look good that you had owed a lot of taxes many years ago, and he made that point. Yeah, it was many years ago. He told me, I don't really want to talk about this, but my daughter had very serious health problems, and he said that he had a choice between either paying for her health care bills or paying the taxes, and he said he paid for her health care bills. And
his mortgage, too. I think
he also, and he lost a house because he couldn't keep up the mortgage on it as well back in 1991.
But all of these taxes have been paid, is that correct?
By Bagneris, Donatus King, and Cheryl Landrieu, that is correct.
So as much as 20 years ago, right? The way this all was just sort of wiped clean.
Right, Michael Bagneris back in 1994. And it's interesting the reaction that I've gotten to the story that I wrote for The Lens. Some people saw it as a very pro-Landrieu story and accused me of being this very strong conservative. Other people said, hey, we think this is important information that needs to be out there. My role was just to put the information out there and let the readers decide one way or the other whether these tax problems mattered today in the mayor's race.
What are the candidates saying? What kind of response were you getting from the candidates themselves?
Bagneris, he was very good. He gave me, we spoke for 45 minutes over the phone. He didn't enjoy answering my questions, especially because he had to talk about his daughter's health problems, and I don't think he'd ever talked about this publicly before, but I thought the public should know about this, and this is the reason he was saying that he did not pay the taxes. Donatus King did not want to talk about it at all. And the Landrieu campaign, to their credit, did give information about the mayor's wife.
Yeah, during the course of a campaign, this kind of stuff comes out anyway, if not from a journalist, from somebody whispering, or from last-minute political flyers that are sent out. So it is a good role of a journalist to play, to go to the facts and sort them out and get to talk to the person. But the fact that you reported it may actually prevent this from being a last-minute flyer-driven smut campaign.
Yeah, I don't know how people will use it. As I said, there are people who in emails to me or comments to the story that I wrote for The Lens have said, hey, this is old news. Why are you even bringing this up? And there's other people who said, hey, I think this does matter.
Yeah, what bearing would this have now in the present campaign if this 20 years old? So what bearing does it have then, would you say, on the present campaign, finding out about this information on candidates?
Well, again, I'm not going to make my own judgment on it, just to say that some people have said this was so old. Michael Bagneris made the point to me that, yeah, I've had I've had problems with money in the past. I know what it's like to have trouble paying bills, and that will help me be a better mayor. Again, I think put the information out there, let the public decide.
And regarding Judge Bagneris, he had been nominated or recommended by Senator Mary Landrieu for a federal judgeship, but the White House did not support that. Were these issues perhaps any bearing on that? Do we know?
You make a great point. We don't know publicly why his nomination to be a federal judge was withdrawn, as you mentioned, by the White House. But I think this is probably a pretty good reason why it did not advance.
And this was the White House under Obama that withdrew that, as an
exactly.
So.
Yeah.
What else are you hearing about the mayor's campaign?
Judge Bagneris, former Judge Bagneris, he is now up with his first TV ad, and he's come out with a campaign finance report showing that he raised about $170,000 and put another $50,000 of his own in the campaign. And I spoke to some people in the inside of the Bagneris campaign talking about kind of what numbers that they need. I think their feeling is that they need to hold Mayor Landrieu to something to getting no more than about 38% of the African American vote, and they think they can hold Mayor Landrieu to less than 70% of the white vote. They've got a shot at winning. That there is a group of white people, particularly in New Orleans, who just do not like the Landrieux, or they're Republicans, or they don't like Mary Landrieu, or whatever. And they see that as a kind of a base of their support within the white community.
All right, Tyler, thanks so much. I'm going to go over to Errol right now to talk a little bit about our retiring coroner who's been there for 40 years. That is a long time to hold a public office.
Yeah, and reading some of the comments, because people have known Minyard towards the end of his career, and there's a lot of memory that's just lost, and I just think it's important to talk about the beginning of his career, that when he first ran for office 40 years ago, it was part of a reform movement. He and Harry Connick ran at the same time, and Harry Connick was trying to win the era of Jim Garrison, who had become very unpopular. And Minyard ran, I remember his campaign, he said, I'm going to be a coroner for the living. Everybody thinks of the coroners in terms of the deceased, and he says, I'm going to go out and where there's disease problems, where there's illness problems, where there's public health problems, I'm going to speak out on it. But the famous story about him is that he says what really got him involved in the campaign was working with a nun who was working with a lot of homeless people, and there was a big problem, especially with homeless people who went to prison and who became heroin addicts, and there was no availability of methadone, and the law only allowed a coroner to have access to it, and the coroner at the time didn't do that. And so he ran partially on that issue too, and gave up his practice and said, I really just want to get involved in this. And there was a book that came out after Katrina called 9 Lives that talked about people in New Orleans. And one of the stories that they tell is Frank Minyard's story. And that was actually made into a musical where you have a singing version of Frank Minyard. The other curiosity about him, of course, was that he was a trumpet player, right, and elected at the same time that Harry Connick Sr. Was elected, who was a singer, not a singer to equal his son. So you had the singing DA and the trumpet playing coroner. But it was really just a refreshing and different time in political life. And in his interviews from a few weeks ago, he admits that perhaps his one failing was not being an effective enough lobbyist for the coroner's office in terms of being able to raise enough money for the types of improvements that it needed. Mm-hmm. And John, I know you've covered that a lot too. I'm curious about your take.
Well, Dr. Minyard and I were in a marathon training group 31 years ago, and that was how we got to know each other. And he has been around for 41 years, and regardless of how wonderful you are, it's time to move on. And I think this latest issue, when he was asked to revise his opinion on the death of, I think it was Henry Glover.
Henry Glover. Mm-hmm.
Henry Glover. Mm-hmm. That, I don't know, he can be malleable. He and I, frankly, got into a dispute. This was 24 years ago about the Adolph Archie case, when this man who had shot a policeman was taken not to Charity Hospital, but to the 1st District Police Station where he was beaten to death. And Minyard kept saying it was an accident, tried to explain it away, and I saw the second autopsy. It was no accident.
So, needless to say, Dr. Minyard, in office for 40 years, really did firsthand observe a lot of New Orleans history and changes in our culture for good and for bad.
It was kind of strange also that he was not a pathologist, but he was an obstetrician gynecologist.
Right, that's a good point.
Which
yes, that's true.
when you're dealing with the dead, it's an odd specialty to come from.
It is. He was indeed a colorful man that dedicated a good part of his life to this community, and was always a gentleman. And I can remember covering his first campaign back in the 70s with his horn blowing. So all the best to Dr. Frank Minyard. I'm going to continue with you, John, but we're going to change subject a bit about higher education. Higher education is continuing to really face some difficulties, particularly here in our community.
It all starts from the fact that there are only two areas in the state government that are vulnerable to cuts: higher education and public health. And nearly $700 million in state money has been cut from higher education since 2008. This year's budget cut of 17.6% was the most acute cut in the nation, according to a survey by the American Association of Colleges and Universities. And
that's, of course, we're talking state colleges.
State money for state colleges. Yeah. I've been calling it slashing our way to greatness, because it's putting people in a terrible bind. Colleges have had to cut back on what they've offered. The University of New Orleans closed its daycare center, which threw 81 households into turmoil because they had to find alternate care. And in the case of international students who live on campus without cars, made them hunt for some place where they could keep their children.
Yeah, it really was a very desired service there, and welcome service when it first opened.
But to my surprise, I found out that it's not the universal service that I thought it might be, because there are a bunch of colleges who do not offer daycare for just that reason, because it is a money loser.
Just too expensive. So looking at our private colleges too, Loyola certainly has gotten some bad news because its enrollment is down.
Right. The enrollment projection was 30% off, and as a result, Loyola has a $7.5 million deficit. It has taken steps to correct it by instituting a hiring freeze and then offering what it calls a voluntary severance program to employees who meet two criteria. They're at least 55 years old, and they've worked for the university for at least 10 years. That's fewer than 200 people, and we'll find out in a week or so how many folks will be taking that offer, and then see what happens next.
What does Loyola foresee in terms of its offerings and its programs? Is it going to have to cut back? Don't
know yet. They're waiting to see. Loyola officials are waiting to see what happens after this severance program shakes out, to see what may have to be done.
What happened with this drop in enrollment for that university? Do we know what caused it?
Several things. I think that there is a finite market, apparently, of 18-year-olds who want to go to college, and parents are being much more assertive now in haggling over financial aid. I mean, it's like bargainers at a Middle Eastern bazaar. They're saying, well, if you won't give me this amount for little Rollo, we can go to such and such where we can get this support and see you around. And you're seeing people who want more value, I think, and it's a strange predicament. I mean, Tulane, which is Loyola's next door neighbor, seems to be flourishing with record numbers of applications, and I don't know, I think Loyola is going to have to do some intense self-examination to see what it wants to do and what it wants to be.
Right.
Unfortunately, this also, if I may interject this, it also happened as Loyola was in the middle of this really ambitious building program on both of its campuses.
So not a good time. Tyler, did you have something?
Yeah, I wrote a story recently for The Lens that there is a big fight going on behind the scenes among the public institutions. It's basically a fight between the two-year universities, or community colleges, and the four-year universities about where the funding is going to go. And as John talked about, with these big budget cuts, the universities are really scrambling for scarce dollars. And there's there's this debate as to where who should get the most. The four-year institutions that are turning out four-year grads to maybe become professionals and things like that, or the two-year community colleges, which are turning out all sorts of grads and people who don't even finish to get hired, let's say, in this oil services boom we've got going on.
It's just part of the whole change in the landscape of higher education, how it's delivered, online delivery, et cetera. We're going to have to change topics now. It's still sort of on the education and business vein, and we're going to go to Kathy talking about new businesses that we should really take a look at and be aware of in this coming year.
Right. I wrote a column recently about, I called it Businesses to Watch in 2014, but actually, and I just looked at a few, but there are many. We've heard a lot of headlines over the past several years from the national press about New Orleans being the comeback city entrepreneurially and all the activity that's going on here. And just this past week, Governing Magazine was the latest one to weigh in and called, hailed the creative comeback of New Orleans. And I think, some people criticize all of this press as being a lot of hype, and there certainly is that element to it. But I think what's happened is that it's not that New Orleans has so much more going on than any other city in the country. It's that I think there's been such a surge of entrepreneurial activity since Hurricane Katrina. And the idea of this occurring during the recovery years after Katrina is just a storyline that the national press cannot resist. Mm-hmm. So that really actually works to the city's benefit because it's really shining a light on all of these people who are really doing phenomenal work. Many of them are students or very young, fledgling business people. And the great thing in this era in New Orleans is that we have so many business incubators now and accelerators that are helping out with, providing spaces for these businesses to locate. Mentoring. Like
Launchpad, for example?
Launchpad, Propeller, there's the IP building. Idea Village was the original kind of business accelerator in New Orleans, and it's now past the first decade mark. But many of these organizations have business plan competitions where fledgling businesses can come in and make a pitch, possibly get funding or talk to investors who might be able to help them go to the next stage. We've had some interesting winners of these competitions. A group of Tulane biomedical engineering students recently won a national student design competition sponsored by a medical association, and they won with a device it's an endotracheal tube. This is how specialized some of this is, an endotracheal tube that enables a safer surgery of the throat. It enables better breathing by the patient during throat surgery. These guys call themselves Team Cutthroat, and they won $20,000 in this competition. And that might not sound like a lot to a business person who borrows $1 million a year to run their business, but it's a lot. $20,000 can go a long way to a little tiny enterprise like this.
Right, and also the types of businesses are mainly, what are we seeing? Is it mostly digital and biomed? Or?
It's all over the map. We see a lot of biomed in these competitions. The New Orleans Bioinnovation Center sponsored a competition, for instance. There's a winner there, Minivax, developed a vaccine for a very specific kind of disease, pneumocystis pneumonia. And they are trying to get that to clinical trials. They also won a $20,000 prize. And then another interesting one in the health arena was a drink called Iconic. It's a healthy drink, an alternative to sodas and sweet beverages. And another $20,000 prize. And he's already in 40 stores around the local area and wants to go regional and eventually national. So. All of these competitions are building a base that really enhance the business community overall and give it a depth we didn't have before.
And drawing in new people and hopefully keeping our young ones here too, right. Giving them business opportunities.
Mm-hmm. If we could just get the manufacturing here too, that would be.
And that's where they're trying to head. Like many of these would like to make these products in New Orleans once they get out of the prototype stage.
I need to jump over to Tyler right now, and you mentioned Launchpad, and that is one of the bidders for the Louisiana Artworks building, which has had a history of trouble.
Right, it's been a white elephant building. About $25 million was spent to renovate existing buildings and create some new buildings just about a block off Lee Circle for people who might be driving around that area. It's specifically on Carondelet at Howard and Joseph Street. And the Arts Council has put the building out for auction, and there are now 3 bidders in the running. The Culinary Arts Institute, which is a coalition of Delgado and some prominent restaurateurs, then Launchpad, which are 3 guys who've been very successful with an incubator in the warehouse district, and then the Louisiana Civil Rights Museum. And it looks like, my best guess is that the winning bidder is going to spend maybe somewhere $6 to $7 million. The state and the city will have a right, I think, to veto the bid that will be before the Arts Council because they are owed money that they would not get paid back if that's the winning amount. But there's some interesting ideas out there. Bill Hines is the key guy. He was the king of Carnival's Rex, as you would know so well, Errol. He's a managing partner at Jones Walker, and in fact, his latest communication to me was he expects to take several weeks for this nonprofit board to choose the winner. And I guess one of the reasons is they've got to kind of negotiate with the state and the city government over the amount of money to be paid without them getting everything they're owed.
Because they could nix a potential proposed project and a winning bid, is that correct?
Right, and the bidders can't just say, hey, we want to turn these into condos. Because of the amount of state money that has been put in the building, it has to have a quote-unquote public purpose. And
it has to be able to pay for itself too, or ideally it should pay its expenses and not be running in the hole all the time, which I think was a problem with the artworks from the beginning. It did not have a clear revenue source.
Yeah, and so the building closed several years ago, and it's just been lying there since then. And so the hope is to put this back into commerce and
Well, the idea originally was to provide spaces for artists and then have the public actually watch the artist's work and then for them to sell their wares. It was a combination of, 5 different buildings. So these new proposals, does that have to be part of it in some sort of way, an actual arts purpose as well as a public purpose?
Well, it has to have an arts purpose, but arts can be a very broad...
culinary arts, for instance.
Yeah, culinary arts, which is they want to create a high-end cooking school or add that to the existing culinary school that Delgado has. And and some people say, hey, this sounds wonderful because cooking New Orleans food, that works well. The Launchpad folks say, hey, what we really need is create an incubator for artists and others in this wonderful space. And then the civil rights people say, hey, we should put a museum in there that honors the history here in Louisiana.
Hard choice because they all sound good and they're all really apropos for our region.
This whole concept of building a building where artists can get together and have artists performing and people go, it was something in vogue maybe about 20 years ago when there was a place called the Torpedo Factory, I think in Maryland, that people, that was very popular at the time. But it just didn't work. I mean, it's just not something that artists naturally do. I mean, go cluster together in one building, and it's perhaps other than people pouring glass or something, it's not that big of a tourist attraction to see an artist think, and so the concept became passe, not just in New Orleans, but around the country.
Well, hopefully this will get a quick resolution because that's a prime piece of real estate and it's a beautiful building. It was done over so beautifully so that the public will indeed get a chance to enjoy that building. Okay, something that we want to enjoy tomorrow night is a win by the Saints. Errol?
Yeah, a lot's being made about that the Saints have never won a playoff game on the road. That's true. The fact is the Saints have never had that many playoff games in their history. I think they've lost 5 playoff games on the road. I don't think it's anything genetic or anything in the water here. I just think it's just worked out the way. And the fact that their championship year, when they won the Super Bowl, they had 2 playoff games was because they were first seed. They were both at home, and probably that team could have won the game on the road. So I wouldn't put too much meaning into that fact, and it can easily be broken. That said, there are some inherent flaws with playing on the road, especially if you're used to playing in the dome and you wind up playing in an outdoor stadium where it's 20 degrees, which might be the case in Philadelphia. The Saints, the Baltimore Ravens that went on to win the Super Bowl last year were pretty much in the same predicament that the Saints, that they had to do it all the way, and then they started off playing Denver, which was seen as being an unbeatable team, and they beat them, and they went all the way to the Super Bowl, and they won the Super Bowl. So there is precedent for someone who's at the bottom, to come, but it's going to be tough. Even if the Saints win, then the next week they're playing Seattle in Seattle, and Seattle's a tough place to win in, and we've already seen them getting pretty much clobbered by Seattle early in the season. So it's going to be a rough road, but not impossible. At least they're there.
Not impossible. I mean, the season has been sort of a crazy season. Like you said, at least they're there. It could be worse in terms of the weather.
It has been.
Because there's going to be some colder weather than what's going to be in Philadelphia tomorrow night.
More important than the weather is the offensive line. I mean, if the offensive line can protect Drew Brees and allow him to pass, that could make a big difference, because that's really been a real flaw in the team this year, that Brees just hasn't gotten the protection he needs.
Well, we believe, we have faith, and they're going to come away with a victory, and we're going to have playoff game number 2, aren't we? Yes,
Is it an accident you're wearing black and gold?
I don't think so.
What a coincidence.
I just noticed that.
That's fleur-de-lis
Not to
all
mention the
over.
fleur-de-lis.
Okay, looking ahead, Errol.
Well, Monday is 12th night. It's January 6th, and that's significant because Carnival this year is March 4th, so it's kind of late. So it's going to be a late Carnival season. I mean, it's short of 2 days of being a 2-month-long Carnival season. And the reason I mention that is it's that much longer we're exposed to king cakes. So beware of, be prepared for a long king cake season this year.
That's okay. More king cake to eat. John, looking ahead.
2 things. One, that we should get a report soon on the search for a successor to Tulane President Scott Cowan. Also, we'll find out how many people will be accepted for Loyola's voluntary severance program. Once that's in, Loyola can figure out what it needs to do to try to set its budget aright.
All right, John. Thank you. Kathy?
Well, we talked about businesses, and coming up in March is the annual New Orleans Entrepreneur Week. But long before March, in the month of January, starting this month, there'll be a lot of seminars and workshops and things leading up to Entrepreneur Week. So if you're at all interested in starting a business, or if you already have, get in touch with Idea Village, ideavillage.org, and you'll find a lot more information about it.
And
it's a good time to be in it.
There are always competitions that are coming
There are always.
up. I mean, they seem to be now just sort of year-round.
They pretty much are
competitions
around the
help
calendar.
businesses, get started. Right. Tyler?
Yeah, what I'd like to remind people is that the mayoral election is less than a month away, and it really hasn't started yet. But now that Michael Bagneris, who's presumed to be the strongest challenger to Mayor Landrieu, is in the race, I think we're going to see the race step up. As I said, Bagneris has already begun his first campaign ad. Mitch Landrieu has already got a couple out, and so really in the coming days, with so little time left, I think we're going to begin to see a more intense campaign going on.
But if the Saints keep winning, that's going to be a major distraction even to the mayoral election.
Well, Michael Bagneris just got in the race, and then he had the holidays, and now he's got he's got a sprint to try to take over a generally favorable, generally popular incumbent who's got a lot more money.
And serious fundraising, too, that he's going to have to do in a very short amount of time. I want to thank you guys for joining us this evening. Thank you very much for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you again next week for Informed Sources. Have a good evening.